Hey, so this tutorial is all going to be about how to layer up tracks and how to maximize the space in your mixes. Ways to do it, ways to do it with different instruments, what you should be looking for, what things will lead to better parts and what things will get muddy, and ways of visualizing your mix so that you're going to create a better sounding mix. We're going to take this track here that I've sketched out. It's a house track, and aim of this video is we're going to take this track from here through to sounding like this. So, where to start? Well, we need to start thinking about our mix in terms of a 3D space that we can actually put this stuff in, because lots of the principles behind how we're going to build this up involves around this way of thinking. Now, I'll just say this before I show you the next slide, is that my day job is to teach music and music production. It's not to do graphic design. So without further ado, here's our lovely visual aid for today. And what I wanted to use this picture for is I wanted to use it to think about the ways that our mix should sound. And I want you to think about your mix to be occupying a 3D space. And in this 3D space, you've got from left to right, you've got your panning. So you can put stuff in your left speaker or the right speaker or in the middle or halfway between or whatever. You've got your frequency, which goes from the high frequencies at the top to low frequencies down the bottom. And you've got your reverb, which goes from really dry, no reverb at the front through to lots of reverb right back here. And the idea behind visualizing it as a box is to try and think about ways that you could fit parts together without them clashing, in clever ways by adding a little bit more reverb, or thinking about the way your frequencies fit together, or thinking about the way that you've panned your tracks will create space without having to delete parts or having to really change the structure and arrangement that you've already got going. So I want to keep coming back to this, but this is where we're going to start from, and we'll start thinking about. And in terms of layering up our tracks, I wanted to start off with the drums at the top here. So here's the actual original drums that I started with for this track. They're all right, you know, there's a nice starting place. Oops, I'll just make sure I select all three channels here. And before we get going on anything else, you can see that even just in this one plugin here, I've actually layered up some of these parts already. So I've got one kick down here. I've got another kick here. I've got one snare here. And I've got another snare here. I've got some hi-hats here. And I've also doubled them up with a different closed hi-hat here. And open hi-hat here. And then we've got a little clap there, and we've got our cymbal hit over the top. So even in just this one part, I've kind of doubled up my kick drums and doubled up my snare drums just to have like a real oomph to what I'm doing here, a little bit of power. Now what I've done here is with your drums, the first thing you can do is usually in your mix, let's go back to here, is that you usually find that there's tons of stuff that pile up in these mid frequencies. So you get your bass and your kick down the bottom, which they can get a little bit in each other's way, but usually the bottom end is not too difficult to control. The mid frequencies are where all your synths are, all your vocals, the main body, your snare, all that kind of stuff. So they tend to get really piled up here. But the top end, you don't tend to have too much stuff up the top end. You tend to have like the stuff that defines your synths and like sibilants on your vocals, all the S's and things like that. And then you also have your hi-hats, your cymbals and things on top. But actually there's usually a ton of space up the top to muck around with. So what I did to start off with, first thing I did was to program some extra hi-hats. So I'll just play them on their own. And if we mix them in with our other drums, you'll see they really do add just like an extra layer on the top there. I'll play the normal drums and then I'll add this halfway through. And you can see that actually it doesn't get too busy. I'm not doing too much crazy stuff rhythm wise here, but in terms of mixing, it's very easy to fit them in because there's loads of space up the top there. The next thing I did is I really wanted to bolster those kicks and snare. So I actually programmed, number one, I programmed an extra kick drum. Secondly, I programmed some extra snare as well, and the snares are here. So we've got this snare here, which adds a bit of body to the snares that I've got at the top. We've got this heavily delayed snare that happens every 4 beats, and we've got this reverse thing here. And the main aim of these extra parts here is you can see that actually these extra hi-hats and the extra kicks and snares and these extra 2 bits here happen over a 4-bar period. So instead of just having the same 1 bar of drums, adding an extra bar of drums and adding an extra bar, so we've got some really intricate drums, but it's essentially the same bar repeated again and again. In this part, I actually introduced elements that span over 4 bars, creating a little bit more interest as you're going along. Now, if we were to put this in with our other tracks, it's going to sound very nice. But before we do that, I wanted to just mention about the kick. And here's another principle that we're going to talk about today. When we're talking about this box here, ways of fitting your mix together, frequency wise, what you can do with a lot of tracks and a lot of parts in your tracks is that you can think about what is the defining characteristic of the instrument that you're listening to. How would you describe the frequencies? How would you describe the sound? And what you can actually do is you can think about things that are missing from that sound and try and double it up with another part that's going to complement it that has the extra bits in. So to go back to here, let's have a listen to this kick that we had on our first beat up top here. Now, I would describe that as a very mid-low frequency kick drum there. There's not that much sub to it. There's not that much slap to it on the top end. It's very kind of middly, very instant. So what I tried to do with this other kick drum that I've got over here is I tried to add in some of those elements. Number one, I added in a bit of sub in there. So the kick drum that I've chosen has got some sub bass elements to it. It's also got some a little bit of the slap to the top of it. And if you listen to this on its own, it's a different character to this one over here. And by combining the bass frequencies out of this and the slap up the top end with the mid frequencies from this kick, you end up with a really, really satisfying kick. So if you play these two together, you'll see what I mean. I'll play this by itself and then I'll introduce the other one. And you end up with this really hard-hitting kick that you didn't have before. And it's the same with the snares. I've tried to choose snares that complement what we've already got going over here. So if you play all of these together, we have this lovely big sound at the moment. And let's do it over 4 bars so you get the real impression of these drums going over 4 bars. And I'm really happy with that. I thought it was sounding really cool. And the last thing that I wanted to put in there, because I felt that there's still a little space on the top that if I wanted to exploit, I could do. So what I did is it got a what's called a topper, and I've mentioned this before in class. But if you go to your loop browser and you type in the word topper, you'll find tons and tons of these things called topper. What toppers really are little loops, like drum loops, that are essentially kind kind of top heavy, so they feature a lot of hi-hats, a lot of bits of snares, but they're not really drum loops in their own right. They're the kind of thing that you would add on top of a drum loop in order to enhance it. I'll just play a few off here and you'll see what I mean. So you see what I mean? They're not like very interesting in their own right, but they can sound great on top of things. So the thing that I've gotten here is a rolling hat topper, and it sounds like this. And by blending that in with the other elements of the drums, it creates a really, really interesting and varied drum part. Let's listen to them all together. I'm really happy with that. The other thing that I did toy with, but I decided it got a bit too busy, is you see that I've got a plugin turned off on here that's called stereo delay. And what that does is it bounces the signal between the left and right speakers in a very pleasing delay fashion. If I play that on its own. And you get that bouncing sound between the speakers. I think in the end, I decided that it was a bit too much with everything else. You see what I mean? But I was really on the fence, actually. I've given it a second listen to just now. I can see why I didn't immediately delete that. I basically just turned it off because creatively I thought maybe I'll come back to that. So actually I'm going to leave it on. I quite like that. So that's our drums. So ways of doubling up our drums. We can exploit our top end. We can beef up our kicks and our snares by thinking about what's missing out the kicks and snares that we've already got. We can muck around with things like toppers and add them on top of our beat. Next, we're going to move on to the bass. Now I've got this really typical house kind of bass. Here you go. And just before I do anything else, it's just good to keep on top of effects that are in your synth themselves. So you notice that in this deep bass synth that I've got on here, deep techno bass, it does come preloaded with some reverb and some delay. And we just need to be careful because sometimes you kind of get on top of your reverb that you've put on a bus channel and you understand the way that that's working and delays that you've put on the instruments themselves, and sometimes you forget. I know I've done it in the past where I've forgotten about some of the effects on here, and it can get very, very busy. And what you can do sometimes, you can just take this stuff off, and what will happen, and we'll go back to our little drawing here, is that by taking the reverb off, it's going to bring that bass right to the front here and make it a lot more immediate than it was before. So have a listen. So you can see when I put the delay and the reverb back in there, it just dropped it a little bit back in the mix. So there is that delay and reverb on there, and it's just worth bearing that in mind if it gets a little bit crowded in our mix later. But something that I thought was lacking from this bass was the proper sub end to it. So I loaded up a deep sub bass patch, copied the part below. The only problem was that this was very muddy at the range that these notes were, so I had to drag the whole load of notes up an octave because it was down here before. Really kind of farty down the bottom there. So I moved it up here, and what I've got going with the bass here, and as you can see, I've rolled off all of the top frequencies here. In fact, I'll take off this EQ so you can hear it to start off with. I've tried to get that subby sound that was missing from the other bass. On its own, it just doesn't sound very good at all. But suddenly, if we just take a little bit of the top end off it as well, so it's really subby. And if we mix that in with our bass that we've already got, we'll find that it's going to bring out this part and add a little bit of depth to it that wasn't there before by layering it up. So I'm going to press play on here, and I'm going to introduce this halfway, and hopefully you'll be able to hear that punch and that bottom end come in. And they complement each other, because this one is adding the definition and this is adding the bottom end. So there you go. And don't be afraid to add a little bit of heavy EQ when you're layering on top of one another. Be careful of this kind of EQ if it was just one bass on its own, but if you're going to try and put two of them together, and you might want to create some space to slot them together. So you might want to do some heavy EQ like that. Next, we're going to move on to some of our chords. So we've got our chords here. Again, very typical housey chords. Again, I've got like a little bit of a stereo delay on there. I've also got tons of reverb on here, just to give it that real epic house feel. If I take that reverb off, it doesn't really have that same atmospheric club vibe. You'll see what I mean if I take this right down. Yeah, you see what I mean. And what I did is I tried to layer it up with something that would add a little bit more definition, because I felt that this was really nice and atmospheric and big and added a great amount to the texture of my tune. But in terms of being defined, it wasn't that defined. So I tried to find something that would add some definition. So I ended up with this plugin on Alchemy, one of the patches. Let's have a listen to this. And by adding in this like mid-frequency definition along with this part here, it gives a little bit more clarity to what's going on with these chords. So again, I'm going to play you this, and halfway through I'm going to bring this in, and hopefully you'll see how it's brought out the layers in it and added a little bit more punch. The other thing I've done here as well is you'll notice that this has more reverb on than this does. And by again going back to this grid here, this cube, it's the idea that by having stuff at the same frequency playing the same parts, by adding a little bit more reverb to one part than the other, it creates space from front to back in order for our tracks to fit in. So where our drums and our kicks and our snares, we might be balancing frequencies. In terms of this part, it was actually front to back, and it was reverb that was really the defining feature as to what I'm trying to separate here. At the bottom, we've got some long chords with a bit of an arpeggiator on here. Let's have a listen. Oh, not really an arpeggiator, but just a repeating pattern on here. And what I thought that could done again, in the way that this was really interesting and epic, but needed some clarity and definition. I did exactly the same at the bottom here and added electric piano on the bottom. So I'll just play the electric piano. Stick them together. And you end up with all of these really nice parts working together. The only thing you might want to do after this, and it's completely up to you, and it's trial and error and see how things go, but we've not mentioned the other way of splitting things up, which is from left to right in terms of panning. So if you find that you can't really slot them together frequency-wise, or you're struggling reverb-wise, trying the third solution and going for your panning is can usually be a productive way of separating different instruments and parts. And what you might do with these, if you've got lots of options basically, so you could go to your mixer here, and we've got all of our parts here. And we can pan them in the left speaker and the right speaker. We could pan both of these parts in the left and these in the right and see how that sounds. Or we could pan one of these parts in the left and one in the right, one of these in the left and one of these in the right. And then it's just a case of, if you like some of the sounds there, I think I preferred it when they were together. You might want them hard left and hard right. You might find they work if you pan them like maybe 30 or something. And it creates a little bit of separation in those mid frequencies while still sounding like it's a whole kind of tune. Let's have a listen to that. So again, we talked about frequency in terms of our drums and kicks and hi-hats and things. We talked about reverb in some of our synths, but now we're talking about panning. And if one doesn't work, maybe one of the other ones would in your mix. And then lastly, we've got our melody part here, or kind of very loose idea of a melody. Just a couple of lines over the top. This is what I started with. And you'll probably notice straight away that this is a slow attack sound. So it takes a little while for the notes to develop. And whilst that's happening, it kind of gets lost a little bit. So similar in the way that I did it with the other synths, I was trying to find something that would add a little bit more punch to it and add a little bit more definition, whilst allowing this part here to just blossom as the notes are held on. And the thing that I laid it up with was something called the Celesta, which is an orchestral keyboard instrument, and it sounds a little bit like bells. So here you go. Probably sounds a little bit like a doorbell as well. And again, if we just play this and we add this in, you'll see the effect that it has, adding that kind of definition and creating a deeper, more layered part. So there you go. So between all of them, there's different ways of layer these up. So we've got our drums at the top that we can actually layer up the rhythms and think about frequencies working together. We can do what we've done with the bass here, which is think about what's missing from one and try to bring it out in the other and blend them together. We can balance frequencies, but we can also use reverb on mid and high frequency instruments to create some separation, and we can also pan stuff in the left speaker and the right speaker. And finally, we can think about what's missing in terms of definition to our parts. Are all our parts equally well defined, or they need a little bit more work? And eventually you can get to that stage where you started off with this, and you ended up with this. And just as a final tip, the beauty of doing this as well is that when you start to do breakdowns, if you've got this and only this, it gives you a lot more limited scope in terms of how you're going to break your track down. By layering up some of the parts, I've got twice as many options when it comes to breaking down the song later, and how I'm going to combine some of those different instruments to create different parts, textures and different sections of the song. So a load of stuff for you to play around with today. Give it a go with your tracks, and I'm hoping that it's going to make them sound a lot better. Thanks, bye.